Do we need to sign in?
No, no voting involved. Yeah, I'll use the mics in a moment. Thank you, Ms. Brazos. Good evening, council, administration, and guests of Friends of Council on listening in live on YouTube. I want to welcome you all to the final committee of the whole meeting of our term as your council on August 24th, 2021. I'll call the meeting to order, and I'll begin by reading the Indigenous greeting. We are pleased to be here today on the traditional territory of Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland. We acknowledge all those who share a deep connection with this land. The City of Beaumont respects the histories, languages, and cultures of all of Canada's First Peoples, whether they be a First Nation, Métis, or Inuit descent, and appreciates that their presence continues to enrich Canada's vibrant communities. We are all treaty people. The peace treaties bind us all. Thank you. Is there any modification to the agenda for administration, please?
Thank you, Chair. There's no modifications to the agenda at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a motion from the committee member to approve the agenda as presented? And on that note, committee members, I've not been trained on using the voting system on the dial, so we'll be using a show of hands on the motion to adopt the agenda. Is there a motion from committee member Hendricks? Thank you, committee member Hendricks. All those in favor? Aye. Hands. Thank you. Motion carried unanimously. Our first item on presentations and delegation will be Council Policy C14, Purchasing Revised, presented by Mr. DeBlanco, Director of Finance. Mr. Blanco, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This draft purchasing policy has been developed to define standards for the procurement of goods, services, and construction contracts for the city, as well as ensure compliance with relevant trade agreements. Background: the city's current purchasing policy was adopted in 2013, so administration conducted a review with the intent to bring the policy up to date. The draft policy, which is attachment 1, was presented to committee on June 15th for discussion. The committee referred the policy back to administration to incorporate some recommended changes. These changes included definitions for trade agreements in section 3, which is the internal agreement on internal trade, as well as the new West Partnership Trade Agreement. Section 7 now includes the addition of the role and responsibility of council relating to procurement. Council also directed administration to look at how Indigenous relations could be incorporated into the social value considerations guideline in section 5 of the policy. A potential addition for this specific request is included in the report for committee's discussion. The purpose of the purchasing policy is to establish a framework of objectives and guidelines for procurement activities within the city. With the draft policy, administration intends to ensure that procurement activities are conducted in a manner that will outline or obtain overall best value for the city, create positive economic, social, and environmental impacts while maintaining open, fair, and transparent procurement processes. Key section of the policy is the objective section, which is section 4. The section provides additional guidance to administration as to the priorities that must be considered when conducting procurement activities. The first priority would be to utilize the city's procurement activities to obtain the overall best value, thereby utilizing tax dollars in the most efficient way possible. Other objectives include open and fair competition, sustainability with respect to the economy, environment, and social impacts, as well as compliance with relevant legislation and trade agreements. The guidelines section, which is section 5, provides guidelines to achieve the stated objectives just outlined. This section includes additional guiding information on obtaining best value, ethics, conflict of interest, confidentiality, social value, use of local vendors, environmental sustainability, and risk mitigation. Sections 6 and 7 address how this policy will be applied and managed within the organization. Based on committee's feedback, administration has added a paragraph to this section explaining the roles and responsibilities of council pertaining to purchasing and procurement that reads: City Council is responsible for approving the annual municipal operating, utility operating, and capital budgets. Procurement authority is delegated from council to the chief administrative officer in accordance with this policy. From there, the section further discusses how the CAO may further delegate this responsibility. Within the social value considerations section, committee directed administration at the June 15th meeting to explore options as to how the city may incorporate specific language regarding Indigenous relations into the purchasing policy. Administration has been working diligently to address Indigenous relations. However, administration did not initially recommend any specific language within this policy on June 15th. At the direction of the committee, administration has brought forth an optional sentence, which is italicized, for discussion within this guideline that addresses diversity, equity, and inclusion and Indigenous relations for the committee to discuss. That additional sentence reads, which is below the first paragraph. Actually, I'll just read the entire paragraph. The city supports equity, diversity, and inclusion and shall implement social value considerations for existing purchasing opportunities, provided such social value considerations are consistent with the city's obligations under applicable trade agreements. The additional sentence reads, these social value considerations would include promoting and participating in viable procurement opportunities with diverse suppliers and Indigenous suppliers when conducting procurement activities. If the committee recommends the addition of this sentence, administration would then further recommend including a definition of diverse suppliers as any business or enterprise that is owned, managed, or controlled by persons belonging to a group that the city identifies as traditionally underrepresented or marginalized. Should this committee be supportive of these additions, the motion would need to be changed to read as amended to include these sections. This policy does align strategically with our municipal strategic plan, specifically Pillar 3 on fiscal responsibility. There are no budget or financial impacts associated with the approval of this policy. At this point, I'll turn this over to the committee for discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Blanco, for your presentation. Committee members, as we're at our usual sit around table in front of our council desk here, we're going to sitting at our assigned seats with our microphones. So if you want to speak, I'll ask you a question in a moment here to hit your speaking button. It'll go in order and I'll have your mic turned on for you. You can ask your questions. So at this point, any committee members have any questions for our presenter? Committee member Barnhart at this point, followed by nobody just yet. Ms. Barnhart, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I hope the mic's working okay. You can hear me okay? Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. DeBlanco, for the report. It's really going in the direction that the committee was hoping it would go. So I do appreciate that. I have a few comments and questions, I think total 3. I'll get to the one on social value last. If I may, just the very first one. In the definition, the very first definition in the policy, try to get it up on my screen so I can see it. It talks about the agreement on internal trade. And at the very end, it took me a while to figure out what that actually meant. It said goods, services, and construction contracts over given values. And values to me meant something different when I was reading this. When I went and looked up the trade agreement, of course, it's monetary values. Maybe it's just me, but would it hurt anything if we put the word monetary in there so that it would clarify the difference between social values and monetary values? I mean, that's just one suggestion for the committee, I think, to consider. But would you see any problem with that?
Thanks for your question. No, I don't see any problem with adding that additional word. It would clarify.
It caught me, and I'm like, what values? Like it was all about values in here. So I was thinking about that. So that's for the committee, I think, to consider. Should I carry on to another topic, or maybe we'll come back to that one if the committee has a?
Yes, we'll come back to that. Thank you.
Thank you. The second one is on page 9 of 11. Hope I've got the right page numbers. And it is about, in the ethics section, it mentions equitably. I'm going to try. Oh, it mentions equally. In the second paragraph, the city shall ensure that all vendors and potential vendors are treated equally. Again, might be a small point, but equally doesn't help when you're marginalized. Equitably brings you to a place where you can then compete on a fair, level playing ground. That might be the language might need to be changed. It might mean that the opportunity timelines might need to be adjusted. Again, if we're going in that direction, that would be, I think, a friendly amendment if it's okay with the administration. But administration have any concerns with equitable versus equal?
Administration, from my perspective, does not have any concerns with adjusting that particular word.
Again, and the third one would be probably the one that's of really is on the table here for discussion, is the best value consideration. So I'm more than pleased to make a motion to approve that additional sentence if committee would like to go that direction, or someone else can, and I'd support it. I just wondered if the administration had any concerns about that additional sentence, why this committee might not want to put that sentence in there.
Once again, thanks for your question. Administration doesn't have any concerns with the addition of the sentence. It was brought to a committee in response to the direction that was provided on June 15th to bring it back to committee for discussion.
Okay, so essentially it's saying that we're going to give more of the marginalized populations an opportunity to participate in our procurement process. And we'll promote that by giving them information about that.
That's correct. The guideline speaks to some additional language on there that would help administration achieve those objectives that were defined in the policy.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
What was your second point? Page 9. What was that about the monetary?
Equitable. The first one was in the definitions around values. So just to clarify that we're talking about that particular agreement is talking about monetary values. Right. So if it's over a certain amount of money, then you have to. Yeah.
The page 9 one.
Page 9 was equitably in the second paragraph instead of equally.
Equitably
in to replace equally.
In best value consideration or under ethics?
It's under ethics in the policy itself. Page 9, right? Yeah. Second within there, the very first line in the second paragraph.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Before I go to my next speaker, if any members are okay, I'd like to address Councillor Barnhart's or Committee Member Barnhart's first suggestion and see how we feel about that, and rather than get too far down the weeds and try and go back and figure things out. So the first suggestion was under definitions. That was on, let's see, page 7 on the agreement of internal trade. Just add the word monetary between given and values. So given monetary values. Are we okay with making that a change as a committee? I'll show a show of hands on that change. Thank you. We'll make that change, Mr. Blanco, if you could, please. The second suggested change is on page 9 of 11 under ethics, second paragraph, to add the word equitable. Yes, change the word equally to equitable on first sentence of the second paragraph. Discussion from the committee on that suggested change in wording. No discussion. I'll ask for a show of hands to accept that change. Thank you very much. And before I get to your next thing, because it is a rather large change, I'll go to our next speaker. Councillor Markov-Swain, you have the floor, please. Oh, I think you hit your button.
Flash.
Hang on. Are we good?
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you for taking in the feedback and coming back to this here. I'll take us back to the whole purpose of this document. And so, administration identified that this original policy was 8 years old, and so they wanted to bring it up to date. Wanted to bring the policy up to date. I'm curious. Over the last 8 years, we had the old policy, and a policy, I think, is a loose word here, more of a guideline, and I'll get into the difference in a second. Was this looked at? Was this measured over the 8 years? Did we look at, as we're moving through looking to procure items, did we look at this to see if this policy was being enacted, or was this just kind of sitting up there and used as a loose guideline?
Thank you for your question. So the purchasing policy from 2013 was used on a daily basis to guide the purchasing activities for the city.
Okay, and so let me maybe rephrase the question. How did you evaluate this? And really, what I'm trying to get to is, if we approve this, how are we going to define success that this policy is working? And that's a challenging piece, because the language in here is there's a lot of language in here that is not specific to. There's some shells, but there is language in here that talks about sorry, it talks about things like, shall consider this and shall consider. So ultimately, you've got a policy, and at some point you're going to tell me to get out of administration's job and stick to my job on policy, and I'll wait for that. But what I want to see out of this is, if we're going to put this policy in place, I'd like to see how the administration is going to say, yeah, this is how we've implemented this policy, and this is how we've been able to get these, this contract or this thing was able to be successful because they went through this policy. So maybe explain to me how you plan on reviewing, as we come through these purchases, reviewing this, how you will consider this policy being successful.
Thanks for your question. So the next step will be to develop an administrative process, so to guide internally our process and procedures on purchasing. The goal of that administration process will once again be to achieve the stated objectives, as well as utilize the guidelines in this policy to frame how the city conducts its purchasing and procurement. We do have a review date in a few years for reviewing this existing policy. And at that time, we would then look at how we've used the policy, should it be approved to achieve the stated goals.
Okay, that makes sense. And so what I'm hearing from that is, this is where you're looking for input from council, and then you guys are going to go away and dive into the meat of it. And really, if I was to get into it, what I'm trying to drill down to, and you're probably not going to go there, is the matrix. And that's what I'm looking at, right? At some point when you're looking at these, evaluating these contracts, you're running, they're competing and they're going up against a matrix. And I would love to find out, where administration is on that, in terms of, the value. We've got all these different considerations to come up with under the guidelines, best value, yes, ethics, conflict of interest. At some point you're putting weighting on this, and you guys are going to be scoring these things, right? And so I'm just curious if that matrix is part of that internal administrative policy that you guys are going to be adopting based on this policy.
I'll address it in two parts, I guess. So the answer to the last question there is yes, there will be some guiding principles, obviously, in the administrative process, guiding how the matrices will be scored. The scoring and criteria for each individual procurement activity might be slightly different depending on what the nature of that activity is. So the matrix could be different depending on what is being procured.
Okay, that makes sense. And you don't have it in front of us here for obvious reasons, and not necessarily a public conversation. So I get that. So thank you for clarifying that. I'll take us back to the conversation around Councillor Barnhart with the social value consideration piece. In the sentence, I guess I struggle here on how you're going to, does this statement have enough teeth? I guess is where I'm coming from. So yeah, the city supports, so I'm on page 4 of 11, the city supports equity, diversity, inclusion, and then it says, and shall implement, right? So shall is a nice strong word, and then you put social value considerations. So when I read this, I don't think this is strong enough to provide that incentive for administration to be able to have enough additional weight for I'll call it a diverse supply, and I'll get into that in a second. So what I would like to see, and this is where you tell me where to stay out of my lane, but I would like to see, as part of that matrices, some sort of value on whatever we define as a diverse supplier, to be able to make sure that is in there. It doesn't mean that the diverse supplier gets it, but that should be, that should provide an additional weight for that supplier to be able to win that bid. So my concern with the language in here is that there is a lot of nice words around it, but I can't see the backing, and all too often, and I see it in my other hat in that world, it's too easy to wriggle out of it, to be able to say, well, we looked at that, but this one came in, and often, the marginalized business or the diverse suppliers, whatever you want to call them, that they fall by the wayside. And so I'm just curious on, does this statement give enough direction or enough teeth for administration to be able to really give these diverse suppliers an opportunity to compete for contracts or whatever we end up going out to the market for? So is there enough weight behind that statement?
Thanks for the question. It's kind of an opinion question. What I'll guide you towards is the objective within the policy, which is sustainability. So that objective is being one of the key pieces within there is social within sustainability. So when we look at the matrices for any given procurement, which will be outlined and how to do so in an administrative process, there will be a weight assigned to that social sustainability piece, depending on the procurement. So that's how we would obtain that. Whether or not this particular sentence in the policy has enough teeth, as you say, I'll refer that back to committee to discuss.
Okay, so basically whether the statement's in there or not, what I'm hearing you share is that the guideline under social value considerations that's already in there essentially gives administration enough weight to be able to consider that with any application that comes in. Where I'm trying to go with this is a lot of policies, and I'm not familiar with municipal policies, but a lot of policies have that direct statement in there that there will be, additional consideration or additional weight for, an Indigenous business or a local business or whatever that's specific in there. In this guideline, I don't see that. So I'm just curious if administration, we talked about this at the last committee of the whole meeting. We talked about whether we'd put something like that in there. So I'm just curious if administration kept it vague for a reason, or and if so, then why wouldn't we have a stronger statement in there about providing additional weight for diverse businesses?
So just to clarify, the policy as presented does not include these sentences. The direction that came from June was to bring back an option to include sentences around this, which was provided to committee tonight for discussion. If committee does have any suggestions or suggested edits to use your term, make it more stronger, committee can discuss and then include that in an amended motion that Councillor Bernhardt put forward.
Yeah, I guess my question was, did you think about including that same? You've put this document in front of us, right? Obviously, the wording here is very specific. Did you think about including something more specific around the promotion of these social value considerations? Right now, the words considerations, I think anyway, and we'll save that for debate in a second, I think it isn't strong enough for what I'm looking for to see in the policy. So before we debated amongst ourselves, did administration look at that and think that considerations was the right language versus something more definite in the definition itself?
Yeah, once again, thanks for your question. Once again, this is in the guideline section. So it's a guiding principle to achieve the stated objectives. After the committee meeting, administration did review the recommended Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 92, as well as explored other purchasing policies for municipalities, corporations that incorporate language very similar to this. And then further, we consulted with our Community and Social Development Department to put together some verbiage for the committee to discuss that would be, once again, achieve those stated equity, diversity, inclusion, or whatnot. So to answer the question, yes, administration did consider that.
Okay, thank you. I'll hold it there. And then we'll, as a group, we'll talk around that definition of diverse supply. But appreciate the background and apologies for the lack of clarity on the questions there. I think you did a good job trying to understand my mumble there, so I appreciate that.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Committee Member Hendricks. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. I just want to talk about the practicality of the process and those who submit for bids, tenders, quotes, whatever you. So somebody submits ABC Company X for whatever the issue is. Do they get some kind of response at the end, whether or not they've been successful or not successful? And if they do, and they're not successful, do they get an exit interview, a bit of this is the reasons why, so.
Thank you for your question. So any proponent that tenders on any specific procurement will have access to the scoring document. On request, it wouldn't necessarily be an exit interview, but on request, if they request how the tenders were scored and how they fared under the matrices, then yes, they would have the results of the procurement.
Right. So the matrix document obviously has a lot of influence on how it actually plays out. Appreciate all the definitions. Some of the documents I've seen over the years include for a number of employees. You have some companies that are worldwide and just win based on points and totals on that basis. So where do you go with things like that? Where say Amazon decides that they're going to bid on all our deliveries. We've got $8 billion of revenue. There's a score. There's the matrix documents. Local guy comes in. Well, I run a van here, and I'd be happy to do it. I've got 2 employees and 2 trucks, but I can keep up, right? How do you do that? How do you deal with that?
So the key objective in the policy is overall best value. So depending on the scoring for this specific procurement, it might be weighted higher, it might be weighted lower. When we talk about sustainability as an objective, we talk about economic sustainability, which would be the local vendors piece.
Okay.
In the guideline, there is a local vendors piece that addresses that administration is, I want to use the correct language here, so I'm going to get it in front of me. So the city may provide preferential treatment to local vendors, given that they are under the procurement limits prescribed in the Northwest Partnership Trade Agreement. Once again, those are the values that Councillor Barnhart referred to at the start of the thing. So there are specified values within that indicate if they are below that amount for a good service or construction contract, the city may provide preferential treatment to the local vendors. In terms of larger scale procurements, then we would go into the specific matrix.
Right. So then the scoring, the points are very important. So they have to be adjusted to all these various definitions so that they're weighted properly, right? Because otherwise you could have somebody walk in, like I said, to use Amazon as an example, would have, the 20 points right off the hop relative to scale and size. And there's nothing else that nobody else can overcome to beat that, right? So you'd have to have something that allows the smaller guy the opportunity to overcome the bigger guy who's already, well set in terms of the matrix and the scores. So that's all I'm getting at. There's got to, it's a tricky thing. It's, I find, I've seen these things in the past, but to find balance is tough. It's tough. So, yeah, thank you.
Our next speaker is Committee Member Van Newkirk. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question around be page 8 of 11, just in the definition of vendor. A couple of the terms you hear around purchasing and procurement are vendor and then preferred vendors. I see preferred vendors doesn't show up on this list. We only talk about vendors, but maybe if you could talk about how vendors that are used over time are price checked or quality checked, and if there are teeth in this policy to help that occur and to make sure that occurs.
So similar to the response earlier on the administrative process, that in that administrative process, we would talk about vendor management, contract management of these preferred vendors for specific amounts under transactions that need to go to tender, let's say. So ongoing transactions with either preferred vendors or ongoing vendors. Once again, there will be language in that administrative policy guiding administration on both contract and vendor management.
And will there be specific amounts that trigger, one process or another?
At this point, we don't have specific amounts to present.
As in X number of dollars triggers this process, or X number of dollars, doesn't trigger the process.
So those amounts are defined in the trade agreements, whether it's over 50,000, 75,000, whether it goes to tender or not, or request for proposal, request for quotes.
So that's that reference back to that is that part.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm still developing my thoughts here. So yeah, that'll be good for right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Van Newkirk. Seeing no other requests to speak, I will clarify the next procedure with our legislative clerk, Ms. Winter. My understanding from our discussion moments ago, Ms. Winter, is that we can now go to page 4 of 11, please, committee members, to talk about the social value considerations. We'll now discuss the sentence in italics that has been suggested to include in the policy, and also the diversified supplier. So Ms. Winter, I believe we can, as a committee, discuss these two, the sentence and the definition, and vote to add them. The only motion we need is that the motion to move this document to council for consideration and approval. Is that correct? Oh, hit the wrong button, did I? Sorry, hang on. Is that
Thank you, Chair. Yes, that is correct. We
Thank
would
you.
have one final motion that we would move everything that has been discussed today to change the council policy as amended with the inclusions.
Thank you. Just 1 second here. My computer is going crazy here. Sorry, committee, give me 1 second here. I apologize. Ms. Winter? Sorry, I don't know what it's doing here. Give me 1 second. I apologize, committee members. Will be with you in just a moment. Do you have any idea what it's doing? That is just. So I have the document on the screen. Actually, no, I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to go right into the committee document. Give me 1 second to find it here. Oh. Yeah, I don't know what to do there. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah, I've got to, all else fails, unplug it. Exactly what I did. Thank you very much for your assistance there. Committee members, I have my screen back up again. So please join me on page 4 of 11. You're probably already there. Thank you. At this point, we will discuss the suggested sentence in italics print, and we'll discuss that as a committee to see if we are okay with the wording as it is or to change the wording. And then the committee can vote to include the sentence as presented or as changed by committee members. And then we'll move down to diverse supplier definition. And then that'll become part of the amended document, which will have a motion to then send it to council for final approval. Is there discussion on the sentence in italics? Councillor Monkoff-Swain, you have the floor on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll try to be clear with my questions here. I understand you've got a diverse supplier definition. Have you thought about how we define Indigenous supplier? And what I mean by that is it 100% owned Indigenous business? Is it an Indigenous partnership that's more than 50%? Is it? So I'm just curious on what administration thought is when you say Indigenous supplier.
So once again, thank you for your question. Indigenous suppliers would be rolled into that diverse supplier if at the direction of council, we could include an additional definition for Indigenous supplier or just include some language in diverse supplier. But in terms of what exactly that is, owned, managed, and controlled by persons belonging to a specified group. So owned, managed, and controlled would, given that language, be more than 50%.
Okay, so just a couple of things. In the definition, you've got diverse suppliers and Indigenous suppliers. So then the definition to me only speaks to diverse suppliers, not Indigenous suppliers. So just might need to clarify that language there, that and. On the Indigenous side of things, there are many Indigenous businesses partnerships that are not owned, managed, or controlled. They're just partnerships that a nation is partnered with a non-Indigenous company, and they've got their own structure that we don't define. So I'm just, by looking at that, if someone came to us and let's say a nation had 40% stake in it, is that enough for the owned piece? It's not managed or controlled. So I'm just curious if we need to, maybe I should rephrase it. I think we need to define Indigenous suppliers better than what we've got in that definition here.
Is that a question for our presenter or just a comment for the committee to consider?
It's a comment that we need to define what an Indigenous supplier is.
In the italics sentence itself?
I would put it under the definition, like with diverse supplier in there. I just think that because you've got diverse supply and Indigenous supplier, I think you could have an additional definition that says Indigenous supplier and then means any business or enterprise that is, etc. I think we need to have that for further clarity.
Okay, if I could clarify your thoughts then, Committee Member Markov Swain, that the italic sentence is fine the way it is, but you're suggesting we need to strengthen Indigenous suppliers through a definition
That's
later
my-
on in the document?
Yeah, adding, so they've
Okay.
got diverse supplier as a definition. I think we need to add Indigenous supplier as a definition.
Okay, good. So you're okay with the italic sentence the way it's written, but we need to clarify a better definition later in the document.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm interested in people's thoughts around considerations, the word considerations, but I'll wait for others to weigh in on that sentence and just see where the feel is for the sentence first before I start to pick it apart even more.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker for questions, Committee Member Van Newkirk, please, you have the floor. Did that get you on the mic? Yes, I think I
Yeah,
did.
it looks like I'm read there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm feeling where Councillor Monkoff Swain is going with this, and a separate definition probably is warranted. One of the things that I've seen a few times is verbiage around, greater than 50% ownership by, those kinds of caveats in those definitions. And in procurement processes that I've been involved in the past, you see that quite often. So, I offer that to the discussion, but personally, I'm not prepared to craft the definition here tonight myself. So thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the italics sentence? We have two more speakers to present their thoughts. Committee Member Barnhart, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question perhaps to Councillor Monkoff Swain, Committee Member Monkoff Swain. I get where you're going with that, but I wonder if we would also have to put some kind of, or ask the administration to look at diverse supplier as well as defining that further, being 50% or more. I'm thinking it's opening up a huge can of worms, but at the same time, I know where you're headed. I do think we need the administration to be clear on who qualifies for this social value consideration. I'm thinking that perhaps it could be any other group that's underrepresented in a particular field of or endeavor, let's say carpentry. And if the diverse supplier is female carpenters, how do they have to own it 100%, or can they just be 50% ownership? So I guess I raise that to say I think the administration is trying to move us in this direction, but we are, as politicians, perhaps getting into the weeds. And I'm wondering if we can somehow saw this off in the middle and say, this is the direction we are going, without getting to the point where we're saying it's 50% or it's 60% or it's 70%. Because I do think diverse is something we're not talking about right now. We're talking more about the Indigenous, and I definitely agree we need to do more to encourage their participation. But then what about the other diverse groups? How are we going to do that? So we're making baby steps, and I do think we need to move in that direction. So if you have an answer to that question, I'd love to hear.
Actually, committee members, I'll ask Committee Member Monkoff Swain for a quick rebuttal to that question. Then I'll move on to our next two speakers, please. Sam, please.
Yeah, rebuttal might be too strong a word, but thank you for no,
Wrong
you're
words.
fine, you're fine. Thanks for clarifying my thought process. Personally, I wouldn't add diverse supplier in here. I think that just opens up too many cans. I would leave it as just Indigenous suppliers. And then to Councillor Van Newkirk's point, leave that for administration to come up with that definition on what that means. I'm also okay to move, like I recognize we want to move this policy forward, and I would be okay, moving this forward into the next meeting there, just with administration to bring that back, or maybe that's an amendment that needs to be made down the road. But I personally think diverse supplies, that's to your point, that definition will be almost impossible to define. So I think we limit it to Indigenous suppliers, And that doesn't, all that means is, when you come up with your matrix, they, whatever percentage that they get, if there is an Indigenous business, it gets an additional percentage point or two or whatever the matrix you come up with. So for me, I would take out diverse suppliers. I would leave it as Indigenous suppliers, and I'd let administration take that away to come up with a definition, to be able to put into that around what Indigenous suppliers mean. And I don't think it needs to be right up here in this policy. I think you guys can figure that out in the background, but for your administration piece, you're going to need some clear guidance around, someone coming to you saying, well, we've got one Indigenous person who works for us in accounting, and we're an Indigenous business, versus we own 51%, or we've got a partnership with X, right? So I think that'll be on you guys to figure out in the administration, and that's those supplemental documents you're talking about.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Committee Member Stout. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'd support the well, I should put a preamble to this. The conversation's moved on since I originally pressed the button to speak. So I'd support the addition of Indigenous supplier in the definitions, and a definition of that, obviously, to be added. Simply and it was one of my first thoughts on reading through this document when I first saw it. Simply to add clarity, remove ambiguity. We've got a statement. The first statement, the italicized statement, commits the city to certain behaviors towards diverse suppliers and Indigenous suppliers. And then we've got a definition of diverse suppliers, but not one of Indigenous suppliers. So, I'm confused as to how that would apply. So yeah, if you got one, I think you got to have the other. Whether we just get rid of diverse suppliers in the first statement and then change the definition to Indigenous suppliers, that would solve the same problem.
Thank you for your comments, Committee Member Stout. Our next speaker is Committee Member Stewart, please. John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to start off, yeah, the conversation's moved since I first pressed it too, but I'm very supportive of the first sentence. I don't have a problem with that. I'd like to see that included. I'm getting down to the two definitions we're talking about, diverse suppliers and Indigenous suppliers. I'd actually like to see a definition of both left in this document, because we're going to leave people out. But my question gets back to a group that the city identifies. What's the mechanism that the city is going to use to identify what's an Indigenous group and what's a marginalized group? Or sorry, an underrepresented or marginalized group? Like what's the mechanism? Like, is it just purely judgmental, or is there some type of policy guide somewhere that we can tap into?
So thank you for your question. The key place that the city administration would look to define that would be the social master plan and the groups identified in there.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, Chair, those are my two comments. I'd like to see diverse supplier, and I'd like to see Indigenous supplier as two separate definitions.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker will be Committee Member Hendricks, followed by Committee Member Barnhart. Perry, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I just to sort of deal with the math and mechanics of Indigenous and diverse supplier discussion. Could it be scalable? I mean, I'm hearing that 50% gets you something, but does 1% get you something? So could you do a matrix that has a scalable conversation attached to it? So if you're at 5%, you get 1 point. If you're at 25%, you get whatever you get. So just to create some kind of balance instead of trying to have a hard definition. And the other thing is, are you expecting corporate searches done on all these vendors, and they're going to be sending in, their shareholder positions, and how do you handle the actual physicality of it? Might be a bit of a challenge. So,
right. Thank you for your question. I'd echo some of the comments that there are some administrative hurdles to including some of these pieces in here that administration would look to work out in the administrative process.
Yeah.
Once again, going back to the specific matrix for the specific procurement, that's where it would be looked at. The item social value considerations is a guideline that will be used to frame the individual procurements to achieve the stated objectives. So once again, it's a guideline. And once the administration of defining what does constitute an indigenous business or a diverse supplier? Once again, that's going to be in the individual administrative process as well as the individual procurement. So it's going to be highly dependent and specific on that. In terms of the specific point scoring, once again, that's below the policy level at this point. So
Right.
We'll leave it at that.
So where I'm going with that is, say you had somebody that had 20,000 employees and 2,000 are indigenous, you know, they don't make the cut in terms of the 50% rule. So I'm just saying maybe there's some way to create some equity on a scalable side. So thanks.
Thank you. We have two more speakers, and what I'll do is after they have spoken, I'll suggest some comments on how best to proceed at this point this evening, because we were looking at getting this document passed at the committee level and sent to council this evening for approval. I think we're going to make it that way, but let's finish our last two speakers first. Our next speaker is Committee Member Barnhart. Kathy, you have the floor, followed by Councillor Monkoff-Swain.
Chair, Mr. DeBlanco, I don't envy your job. This is a balancing act. And when I reread it and I look at local vendors as well, so with local vendors, to a point that Councillor Monkoff-Swain mentioned, that's a may, it's not a shall. So, I do think that we have to look at all of these factors, and the social value consideration is definitely something that we're trying to do better than we've done in the past on that for sure. And I do believe it's going that direction. I will agree with the mayor that I don't think now is the time to take diverse, not vendors, is that what we said, vendors? Suppliers out of the equation, because I do think there are other considerations besides the indigenous relations. That definitely is a high priority, but I do think there's others. So I would say this is the direction that I'm comfortable going as it is now, and I wouldn't change that sentence, but that's just my opinion at this point.
Thank you. Committee Member Monkoff-Swain, you have the floor.
Yeah, I want to get this through, recognizing just where we are in the term. And in order for me to be able to do that, I think instead of me trying to get up here and craft this and win support for this or that, my gut is to move forward with what's in front of us with that sentence. And then, whether I'm here or not in a year or two is maybe it's seeking administration to come back and let us know how we're going with this. And I think that might be the better approach than for me to try to change this on the fly here. I do appreciate the fact that you've got this through. I think administration is hearing what I'm trying to get to, and what I think all of council is trying to get to is to make sure that local indigenous diverse supply has an opportunity to be able to compete in this space. So for me, I think I'll pull back my comments and my questions and my recommendations here, and just share that I will be supporting moving this forward, and then whether I'm here or not down the road, we'll be looking for an opportunity to come back and see how this is going. And maybe at that time, the administration will have learned more things. Hey, we're struggling with identifying this or that, right? I've got a million suggestions, but here's not the place up at this meeting. So I'll yield there, and just know that I'm happy to move this forward as is in the sentence, and look forward to hopefully checking out how this policy works going forward. So thank you for answering the questions here, and sorry for taking up so much airtime to be able to try to get my points across. Thank you.
Thank you, Committee Member Monkoff-Swain. So having said that, committee members, the tone of the room is what I'm reading is we could look at actually approving the italic sentence as is, which is these social value considerations would include promoting and participating in viable procurement opportunities with diverse suppliers and indigenous suppliers when conducting procurement activities. So I will ask for a show of hands to support the sentence as read in the document. All those in favor? I'm seeing unanimous support. Thank you, committee members. At this point, I'll ask legislative clerk for a point of clarification. I have got the feeling from committee members that they may want to look at adding a different type of supplier to the document. If we chose to, I'm not saying we're going to, I'm asking for point of clarification. If we don't go down the path of another supplier, we can simply approve the diverse supplier definition, and then can go to council tonight for approval. Is that correct? If we make that motion? Oh, sorry. Oh,
Thank you, Chair. Can you please clarify what you're asking me?
Okay, thank you. So we have now passed the italic sentence for the document. If there's been some committee suggestion that we may want to add a second supplier definition, such as indigenous supplier. If we don't do that tonight, we simply add the diverse supplier, we can proceed tonight, correct? To go to council?
Thank you, Your Chair. If the committee has consensus with adding Indigenous supplier as discussed this evening, you can add that into the policy prior to it going to council. If you wish that not to be added, you could still change the policy when it comes to council at the meeting. You can still have a chance to change the policy and add it in there, or approve it as amended now, or approve it as amended at the council meeting.
Okay, so it's clear in my mind, 'cause I know this is going to council tonight. If it comes out of committee this afternoon, it goes to council tonight for approval. So if the committee is okay with diverse supplier as is and not making any other changes, we're okay with that. It's my understanding.
That is correct.
Okay. Is there any discussion from the committee to have a different supplier definition discussed today? Are we okay with going forward with a diverse supplier on a vote basis? Okay, seeing no discussion, I'll ask. I'm sorry, Kathy, I apologize. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chair. I think the point was made and was made well. If we define diverse supplier the way we have here, and we don't define Indigenous supplier, we're going to leave confusion. And I personally don't think that would be too tough for the administration to provide it to us at a later date. We could pass it with that proviso that will be included as a definition. I mean, that's how I would see it, but I don't know, maybe Mr. Blanco, that you need us to actually have the words in front of us for that definition before we pass it.
So once again, fully respecting committee's comments, how administration crafted this definition for diverse supplier would include Indigenous suppliers, being that Indigenous suppliers would be considered a diverse supplier under this definition.
Could I make a suggestion then? Could the title, if I may, Chair, could the title of the definition be diverse suppliers and Indigenous suppliers?
Yes, administration would
And then that would
be fine with that.
cover it.
I would suggest diverse and Indigenous suppliers.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Committee Member Stewart, you had a question there? I saw your flag go up.
Yeah, no, that was going to be my suggestion. Is we don't have to overcomplicate this tonight. If we wanted to include the Indigenous, we could either do one of two things. We could call it diverse and Indigenous suppliers to match the sentence previously approved, or we could add Indigenous supplier and use pretty much the same wording as currently diverse to supplier, just to get that baby step going first. So, but you guys already made that one, so that's where I'd go. I'm good with diverse and Indigenous supplier so that it matches.
Thank you for those comments. Any further comments before I ask Councilor Markov-Swain? You have the floor, please.
Yeah, I'm supportive of that diverse and Indigenous supply. I just ask administration, we've got a group that we're talking to from an Indigenous perspective, and to take a look at this, I'd get them to take a look at that, and I think they'll be able to help you define that, and that's something you guys can look at as you go, as we work our way through the policy. So I'm good with that. Let's move it forward tonight. But I would recommend, through our conversations or through your conversations with some of the Indigenous support that we're getting, looking at our overall, the way that the city's going, is that they'll have some language on that owned, managed, and controlled. It's very, I hate to use the word colonial here, but we just need to make sure that is inclusive enough. So I'm good with moving this forward tonight and then looking at it down the road.
Thank you. Appreciate all the comments, committee members. So looking for a vote then from the committee members to change the wording of diverse supplier to diverse and Indigenous suppliers. All those in favor of that change? Unanimously. Thank you very much. Thank you. So having said that, committee members, I believe, are there any further questions from committee members on this document before we move to the motion stage? Seeing none, thank you very much. Committee members, as you know, we've made 4 changes this evening. They are change the word to monetary in the paragraph up on ethics there, and on the not ethics, on the definitions, also monetary policy. We have adopted the italic sentence in the document, as well as changed diverse and monetary and Indigenous supplier. So I have taken liberty preparing a motion for the committee. I'll allow someone to make it a motion in a moment here. The motion being that the committee of the whole refer council policy C14 purchasing to council for approval as amended. Is there a committee member willing to make that motion? Committee member Stewart, thank you very much. All those in favor of that motion, show of hands. All showed unanimously. Thank you, committee members. Appreciate that. Our next order of business in the committee of the whole is closed session. There are no closed session items. Are there any councilor inquiries which to make at this time before a council meeting in about 3 minutes? I'm assuming not. Oh, Commissioner Stewart, you have the floor. What do you think? Oh, hang on. There you are. It should be
I'm
on
used to
now.
working this end of the thing. I'd just like to take a quick opportunity to thank you, Deputy Mayor Daniluk, for chairing Committee of the Whole for the last 6 months. This is the last Committee of the Whole meeting of not only your term as Deputy Mayor, but our term as council. So I wanted to thank you for your able leadership in steering this committee and appreciate it very much. And I'd
Thank
like
you.
to
Very
thank,
generous comments.
members of council for some broad and some interesting discussions over the years. And thank you for your participation in this venue as well. So I just wanted to say a quick thanks.
Thank you. Mayor Stewart, much appreciated. Next item is information items. Any members, information items from any members? Any emerging issues? None being, I will adjourn the final committee meeting of the whole of our term as council. Thank you very much. We'll reconvene the room for our council meeting at this time. Thank you.